Welcome back to Bible Reading Today, our trip through Romans and looking especially at the doctrine of assurance of salvation. I'm glad you've joined us again today. Now, we saw in our previous studies that there are two kinds of men. One kind of man has the Bible and the other kind doesn't. And we also noted that both kinds of men are guilty before God because both kinds of men have enough knowledge of God to be held accountable for their disobedience. Now, this raises a question. If it makes no difference if some have Bibles, then why have some been given Bibles, that additional revelation of who God is that comes through our Bible? Could it be that those who have Bibles have an advantage by being in some special position toward God? Well, chapter 3 answers these questions. And that answer begins in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3. The word of the Lord says this, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what's the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God." Now, the admission is frank. Men who have Bibles, represented here by the Jews, men who have Bibles have an advantage over men who have no Bibles, that our text refers to as the Greeks. And they have an advantage because the Bible tells us who God is and what God's rules are for living. Imagine trying to drive in a strange country where you don't know the rules of the road. In order to drive safely, you have to know the laws that govern driving. But there's a problem that comes with that knowledge. If you know the rules and you don't keep them, then when you break them, you'll be held more accountable for breaking the law because you knew what the truth was. So God has given some men Bibles, but because those men don't keep his laws, they're actually in a worse situation than the man who has no Bible, because with more knowledge comes more responsibility. Now, because of this, we're told in verse 9, "What then? Are the Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we've already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin." Again, the problem isn't the kind of knowledge of God one has, but our inability as men to keep the laws that God has given us as we know them. And the text goes on to tell us that because of this, all men everywhere are accountable to God. Verses 19 and 20 say, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin." The use of the law, in other words, is not to give men a way to be saved, but rather to prove to us our need of salvation by showing us that under no circumstances can we actually be good enough to merit God's mercy. And the question follows, how then can anyone be saved? Only by God's grace received through faith. Verses 21 and 22 tell us, "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe." Grace is God doing for us what we could never do for ourselves. And we're told here that God provides to us the perfect righteousness that we need, his very own righteousness, and it comes to us apart from the law, and it's given to anyone by means of faith in Jesus Christ. Now, understanding this is crucial to receiving assurance of salvation, because our natural way of thinking is that we have to perform good works. We have to keep the law, in other words, to be accepted by God. And since we can't please God by keeping the law because we can't keep the law, well, naturally, we question our salvation. We have to be certain that salvation is by God's grace alone and not by our good works, and that salvation is received through faith alone, trusting and obeying God, nothing more, nothing less. We have to be certain of this in order to be assured of our condition. Now, we get a further explanation of this in our next lesson. Thanks again for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you then.